Okay, fantastic. Welcome, everyone. I am so excited to see everyone here today and welcome you all. Thanks so much for being here. My name is Am Ironstar, and I am the Executive Director at the Saskatchewan Arts Alliance. I am a white mid-30s non-binary person with short brown hair. I'm wearing dark kind of rectangle frame glasses. I have on a black t-shirt and a blue polka dot bandana. Before I acknowledge the lands on which we're on today, I'd like to start by acknowledging that I inhabit this land as a person of settler ancestry, and I recognize that because of that, I have benefited from colonization and stolen land, and that colonization has brought and has and continues to disrupt Indigenous well-being. So we acknowledge the people who came before us on this land and all of the knowledge that has been passed down since time immemorial. This land has been called home by Indigenous people. By honoring the land, we acknowledge the teachings and wisdom gained by peoples past and bring that knowledge into the present and future. Today, I'm speaking to you from Treaty 4 territory, which is the traditional lands of the Saulteaux, Cree, Nakota, Dakota, Lakota, as well as the homeland of the Métis. And I'm grateful to live and work here on Treaty 4 territory. And as a provincial organization here in Saskatchewan, the work of the SAA reaches lands covered by Treaties 2, 4, 5, 6, 8, and 10. So for any of you who might not be familiar out there, the Saskatchewan Arts Alliance, the SAA, is a nonpartisan member-driven coalition of arts organizations that provides a collective voice for the arts community to the public, government, and arts and culture agencies. And we work to strengthen, support, and advance the arts ecosystem through advocacy, public education, research, policy development, and proactive leadership. I'm going to start with a couple of housekeeping items to address. So we're really thankful today to have Sue and Barb from Saskatchewan Deaf and Hard of Hearing Services today to provide ASL interpretation services. And I'm trying to pace myself at a reasonable rate to make their lives a little bit easier. So I'll ask, we'll try to keep that into consideration. And we've also enabled auto transcription or captions at the bottom. So feel free to enable that if you want. You can toggle that on and off at the bottom of your screen. If you have any technical difficulties, please let us know in the chat and we will do our best to assist you. There's a few of us from the Arts Alliance here today that are kind of on the problem solving and technical end of things, so we'll keep a close eye. We are going to be recording this session and posting it to our YouTube channel. So just we ask that you keep yourself muted unless you're speaking to eliminate any unnecessary background noise. We welcome questions. You can type them in the chat. Also, this is kind of like, an opportunity for discussion. So if you also want to raise your hand and, unmute yourself, please feel, you can ask your questions that way as well. And this can happen throughout the panel. Yvette and the panelists have said you're welcome. We don't need to wait till the end or anything. It can happen as we're going. Please feel free to share your name in the chat, your pronouns, where you're from. We're planning on the morning session today wrapping up at about 11:30. We're going to take a 10-minute break at about 10:50. And the afternoon session is going to start at 1 p.m. today on the same Zoom link. I'd like to take a minute to thank our funders, Sask Culture and Sask Arts, both of whom benefit through lottery ticket sales through Sask Lotteries. Yay, Sask Lotteries! New 6-year lottery license agreement was just signed, so that's always super exciting. Sask Lotteries funds cultural organizations all across the province, and we wouldn't be able to do the work that we do without their support. Okay, so why we're here. At last year's AGM, the SAA passed an important bylaw amendment regarding our board member honorarium policy. And basically, what that was, that we passed a policy in order to be able to pay board members a small honorarium as a fact of recognizing their time and service. So it's not full compensation for their time. It's just saying that we know that being a board member, you might incur expenses that you might not kind of be able to, that you might need help with. And so we saw this as an important, tangible first step in reimagining our own governance and making our organization and our board more inclusive and representative. And, after almost, we're coming up almost on a year of that happening. It'll be a year in the fall. And it's been quite successful. And I'll be looking forward to kind of talking a little bit more about that later. But our work in this area it didn't stop there, and it's continued over the past year. And I'm excited to have an opportunity to share some of those changes with you after this panel. And at the last AGM, we talked about this kind of reimagining governance idea. How can we do governance different? And we kind of asked if there was an appetite for more discussion of this nature. And everybody said yes. And so here we are. And we're really excited that we have the chance to follow up with you today on that. And we're going to discuss new governance models, reimagining nonprofit governance. And with that, I could not be more excited to introduce the moderator and lead for this morning's panel discussion, Yvette Nolan. Yvette is a playwright and a director and a dramaturge, and it has been my absolute pleasure to get to know her a little bit better over the course of my time here at the SAA. And yeah, I'll pass it off to you, Yvette. Thank you so much.
Miigwech, miigwech, ani, kwekwe, bonjour, Yvette Nadizhnikaz, Gitaganzi B Nondanjiba. My name is Yvette Nolan. My people are from Gitaganzi B Algonquin First Nation, which if any of you watched the news net last night, you may have seen that my community is thinking about buying a sports team or something. I don't know. It's very odd to me. But I live here in Saskatoon in Treaty 6 territory. My father was Irish off the plane. And so he was my mother's math teacher in her residential school. I am a product of the residential school system in this country. So I am so grateful to be able to bring these people together in this room to talk a bit about, all of these issues that we're facing in this moment. What I've asked our panelists to do is each introduce themselves, whatever that means to them, because it's better than us reading bios, which you can go and look at on the website. But then it gives each of us an opportunity to talk about how we came to this subject. I will introduce myself in a way that sort of models it so that we can move forward. I use the pronouns she, her, but I'm pretty easy about pronouns. I am a theater rat, a playwright, a director, a dramaturge, a half-breed, as I mentioned. I ran Native Earth Performing Arts in Toronto for a decade in the early 2000s. And at that point, I always grappled with the governance structure. So what it meant to have a board of directors, what it meant to answer to, I'm making air quotes, answer to a board of directors. When I left Native Earth and I came to Saskatchewan, I was working here in various capacities, and I eventually got frustrated enough to go back to school. I'm currently pursuing my master's in public policy at Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy here in Saskatchewan. And my research topic is governance of nonprofit arts organizations. So eventually I figured if I was going to make change in the system, I needed more tools. So I went back to school and I learned a bunch of another language, and I've been working towards some kind of alternate model ever since, as well as working towards the end of my thesis, which should happen in the next 6 months. Which is to say, none of us I don't think any of us woke up one morning and thought, I'm going to work in governance. We all actually had practices or things that drove us into governance practices that have turned out to be really useful. So having said that, I'm going to throw to Jordan and ask Jordan to introduce self.
Oh, Yvette, you're so good at setting the tone for the conversation. Thanks so much for inviting us into this process. My name is Jordan Baylon. I use they, them pronouns. I am a bald, brown, Morenix, Filipina. Let's see, I'm wearing thick glasses today to hide my morning bags. I have earrings on, kind of shaped like leaves, and I'm wearing a black tunic buttoned up. I identify as a 2.5 gen Filipinx settler and uninvited guest. Born and raised in Mokinsis, which is the Blackfoot name for the city of Calgary in Treaty 7. Yeah, I have a lot of different practices, just like I think everyone else in this space. I'm an artist, a writer. I do some work around art criticism. Recently, I've been dabbling in dance and a lot of other sorts of artistic intersections, which are really interesting to me. But I think at the core of my practice is our community focus. For a long time, I worked as a philanthropist. So I worked actually as an arts administrator, working for my local arts council. And I kind of had my awakening from the Matrix moment after almost a decade working within that structure. And so when Yvette's talking about, how did we all come into thinking about the systems and structures and governance, for me, it was as a funder responsible for creating and maintaining and then supporting people moving through processes that over time became clear to me were inherently harmful or were connected to structures and systems that seemed to be inherently harmful. More on that later, but all of that to say that awakening within that sort of a system and then doing a lot of my own healing and unlearning and working alongside community and really developing a capacity for relationality has now brought me to a place where I've shifted my practice to working at a really grassroots level. So specifically leveraging, all of that experience to support people to kind of move through the nonprofit and hack it. So I'll share more about that later, but yeah, I'm really happy to work in a lot of different ways where I'm mostly just witnessing folks, telling their story through these sort of anti-oppressive values with them and, imagining different futures together. So I'll just leave it at that for now. Thanks for having me.
Miigwech, Jordan. Erin.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much, Jordan and Yvette. I'm so happy to join you. My name is Erin Kang. My pronouns are they and she. I'm a Korean non-binary femme in my early 30s with long black hair that's pulled back today. I'm wearing thinner rimmed glasses than Jordan, but still trying to hide my bags too. And today I'm wearing a handmade t-shirt dress with a pink, white, and green pattern by my friend Katie. I'm joining you from Toronto, Treaty 13 territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I'm here representing the Ontario Nonprofit Network, an independent network doing advocacy in Ontario to support a thriving environment for nonprofits, charities, and community groups. But I guess my origin story from birth, I was born in Niagara Falls, but grew up in Niagara-on-the-Lake as probably inaccurately, but I like to claim like the Asian family in the lake at that time in the 90s. And thus my early identity was very much formed out of otherness. And when I found myself in Toronto as a preteen, really beginning to navigate my relationship with self. So I found myself very much in my early 20s in grassroots art spaces. I definitely am a creative. And for me, my foray into governance was actually mostly centered around my interest in exploring how power, place, and people intersect. My studies were in sort of human geography, history, and city planning. And so very much asking questions always of how do we live together? What are the circumstances that brought us here? And how do we thrive into the future together? And so when the opportunity came to join this project around reimagining governance, which I'll save for later in the conversation, for me, it was really an opportunity to explore my interest in power and liberatory futures in this new way within the nonprofit sector, which is where my early career started. So I'll end there and just really looking forward to the rest of the conversation. Thank you so much.
Miigwech, Erin, and Tarin.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to share this space with you. I always find it so special when I get to see into people's homes when we're talking on Zoom. I feel like I'm like, maybe we're having a coffee in your living room or 5 living rooms. My name is Tarin Dehod, and I am pretty unconcerned with my pronouns, but usually I'm referred to as she or her. I am a white person in, let's just go with a middle age and not a specific age. I have long brown hair. I'm wearing a white shirt. Something that is important in how I identify freshly is that I'm learning about my settler ancestry, but also my relationship to my great-grandmother, who was a Polish Jew, and my Ashkenazi Jewish heritage, which is really meaningful to me in learning about myself right now. I was born on Mi'kmaq and Wabanaki Confederacy land that is known as Prince Edward Island. And now I live and work on Treaty 6 land, and I am an uninvited person on this land. And that's important for me to think about when I'm when I'm walking around, when I'm working, when I'm sharing with people. And something that has been really influential to me also is lately we've been having conversations with the collective at AK, which is probably the primary reason that I'm here. And one of the collective members, Aurora Wolf, pointed out that when we talk about the First Nations land and the homeland of the Métis, that the distinction should be both traditional and modern. It is also the current homeland of these First Nations and the Métis people. I am a parent, I am a partner, and I have throughout most of my life thought of myself as a curator, but I am also thinking a lot about the colonial implications of that term, the violence of the institution, and how just personally in the work that I've learned to do, it doesn't represent the relationships and the connectedness that I feel with the communities and the folks that I work with. So I'm kind of grappling with, you know, a label. I don't know what I am really. And I do work at AK, Artist Run Center in Saskatoon. And I was known as the executive director here, but we are also undertaking thoughts about what our role designations mean and what those labels mean and trying to do that slowly and in an authentic way. And I came to governance throughout my life. I really pursued what I perceived to be as a successful path to my ultimate goal of working in a large institution. I have a background in art history and classical studies. And I felt that my success was tied to how well I could fit inside the institution and represent the institution. And it has taken, I would say the last 8 years have been the most impactful for me in unraveling that. And that is a credit to all of the folks who have poured their own thoughts into me, shared space with me, visited with me. And the work that began at AK through governance isn't my work. It really is the work of the collective. And the collective is majority equity deserving folks. And I want to recognize that it is extremely complex for me as a white person to show up and talk about this work that does not belong to me. And I'm embarrassed to say that really the point for me in thinking about governance and trying to unlearn what I've been taught for such a long time and what I celebrated for such a long time was when the board structure started causing harm to me. And it took that moment for me to say, if it's causing harm to me, I need to look around the room and think about how it's impacting folks who are showing up to do work that they believe in, who are participating in traumatic conversations for them, emotional conversations for them, that I don't experience. And from there, really, there was a lot of open folks at AKA who said, I proposed this idea to them to form a collective, and they said yes. And really from there, it's this work belongs to all of us. And I have to also say, I'm going to end now, but Jordan Baylon has been an amazing, immense mentor to all of us. And so I'm really excited to share this space with everybody, but particularly Jordan, who I see their face and they just brighten my day automatically. So thank you.
Thank you, Tarin. I do, in the effort of not working like this, but actually working like this, which is a thing we do in lots of my rooms. I do want this to be more of a conversation than a bunch of talking heads. And that means inviting us to interact with each other and inviting those who are on the interwebs watching to also enter into the conversation. So have your pens and pencils near, folks, to make notes. I did ask in prepping for this. I remember several years ago, I had just moved to Saskatchewan, I think, and I was coming up the road with Noreen New, who's a former arts, who was an employee at the Saskatchewan Arts Board, from Regina to Saskatoon. And this is when I was floating the idea of a different model of governance. And at that stage of the game, so it was maybe a decade ago, Noreen was like, but it's all we've got, Yvette. You can't do it. It can't be done. And I was like, but what if this, what if that? But I'm grateful for that conversation because she kind of dramaturged what would start to be my thesis work by saying it can't be done. This is the way it's done. These are the obstacles. How would you get around this? Forcing me to think it out into the air and articulate it. And here we are, the pandemic's happened and suddenly it feels to me like we are in a possible change moment. Of course, nothing is like a singular moment. It is on a continuum. So we were getting ready for the change, but I think there are moments in time when bigger change is possible. And I think we're in one of those moments. I've asked the panelists to each think about, to talk a bit about the context in which they are working and to give an example of a change moment, or of something that is changing, or of a different model. It's a pretty open prompt. But I also asked Erin to start with this part of the discussion.
Oh, I think I forgot that I was supposed to start, but I'm ready. Yes, and so, okay, so it doesn't surprise me, Yvette, that a decade ago, there was a prevalent sort of idea that this is what we have, and we can't do anything about it. And I would argue, actually, still to this day, some people might feel that way. And I think that's because the myth of what, even what governance is broadly, what boards do, those kinds of things really hold us back. So to back up, about 5 years ago, a small group of consultants here in Toronto had a conversation, one of which is my project co-lead, Linda Mollenhauer. And basically the conversation was, why are we teaching this when it's not working? We need to rethink what we're bringing to organizations, and telling them about governance and how they need to do it. But what does that mean? What do we need to do? So the foundational research really began with, okay, let's look at the impacts and trends of governance in Ontario specifically. And so some research was done around that. Some research was done, interestingly to me, around what sort of emerging or younger or newer leaders were, what their opinions were about governance. And for me, critically, the fact that people were just not interested in the way that governance is done now, and not interested in participating in a governance system or structure that just doesn't feel good, doesn't feel equitable, doesn't feel caring, and we're looking for other ways to fulfill those spirit needs, right? Without entering that sort of traditional governance space, which is a problem for nonprofits, because we are facing many people retiring or leaving governance volunteer positions, and a lot of organizations really feeling the strain of recruiting new board members. So that research was done. And then from there, when I joined the project, we asked organizations, nonprofits in Ontario, is there a problem? Are we on the right track? Are we on to something? What are your experiences? And overwhelmingly, the answer was yes, this is an issue. We don't know what to do about it, but this is something that we're feeling. And so when we started the project, our question was, okay, how can we shift how nonprofits are doing governance? But more broadly, how can we shift how we think about governance in general? I think we can get locked into this idea that when we talk about nonprofit governance, we're talking only about the board of directors. But governance as a concept is about how we make decisions together. Right? It's about how we are creating systems of accountability with those decisions. It's not a checklist of board roles and responsibilities. And in fact, what the board is, responsible for has been conflated over decades. And they are tasked with a large number of strategic, generative, but also fiduciary responsibilities that, a volunteer board, and, we're in an art space, like just thinking my experiences in the grassroots arts world, like a volunteer board of potentially young people or potentially folks who are facing multiple barriers to do all that work. So we really came in saying, we can't just make another model, right? Organizations, and I think Yvette wrote this in the article, theater boards by theaters, like governance structures for theaters by theaters, something like that. So asking, rather than how can we change this one structure of the board, to opening the question up to how can we just change how we're making decisions together? Right? And how is the board one aspect of that? And what other collectives, structures, processes, other ways of engaging can we put in place to make governance work for our unique circumstances? Even in Ontario, there's 58,000 nonprofits, all with extremely different circumstances. We can't have 1 or 3 or 5 or even 10 governance models for people to choose from. We need to create pathways for people to really design what that looks like for themselves. I'll just pause there and let other folks chime in. Thank you.
Cool. Great, Erin. And thanks for that. I'm just reminded when you talk about that, we didn't start this conversation looking at the participants in the room. One of the things we talked about when we were setting up this conversation was, let's start at a different point. Let's assume that everyone in the room already knows a lot of the things. So we're not starting at like, these are the problems with the board of directors structure. And, you know, knowing that some of that would just fall out. Erin just articulated some of the challenges of the structure, which is great, but we're not. So we assume looking at the participants that like everybody knows. So we're starting the conversation point D or point E instead of point A, which is great. And if people want more clarity on some of those things, they'll chime in and ask. Yeah, I'd like to go actually to Tarin at this moment because I've been fascinated by what's been happening at AKA, and you know, Tarin and I have spoken about it quite a bit. And so, of course, now it feels like I've directed you to talk about it, but Tarin.
It is so challenging. Just listening to Erin, it's challenging not to talk about the problems when you're also thinking about the future, because they are, you know, they are part of the same whole. And I loved what you said about making decisions together. And I think when I saw, when I came to AK, within 1 month, there was a board crisis. And I was like, I am leaving. Like, I was ready to pack my bags. I'd never been here before. I had one bag. I was living with just somebody I didn't know. And I was just like, I'm out. I can't do this. And of course I didn't do that. And I'm really glad that I didn't do that. But what followed over the next years was me being able to learn and look at different organizations and ask questions about what was working for them and what wasn't working for them. And something that became really apparent to me is that we don't program governance work. You know, we show up as institutions by, you know, forgive the word, our programming, our projects, what creatively we present with the community, hopefully in a co-authored way, which is something that we're really working toward. And so when I started talking to colleagues, I started saying, but what's going on behind that? And I started realizing that a lot of the people that I look up to and follow are embedding the leadership and governance work that they're doing within their programming. And so we're feeling it and we are experiencing it, but it's not so distinct that we're necessarily applying it to leadership and governance strategies. And so when I started looking at what we were doing at AK, I said, you know, we're at a point where I am so deeply proud of the relationships that have been built from the founding of this organization. We began in 1971 as a collective of women who were unsupported in the community and felt that they needed to bring together a space for other folks and themselves. And so to be true to that was thinking about, for the collective, how can we be authentic, not just in the relationships we have with communities and artists in our programming, but what that means at the core of who we are, how we come together, how we make decisions to run the organization, all the paperwork and the contracts and the budgets that are largely inaccessible for lots of people on the board. They don't want to pore over those things necessarily. And so it was really this core thing that we want to align our programming and our trusts with the leadership at the organization. And something that has been key is, for me particularly, other people knew this already, is understanding that the system that we're working in is historically part of the Catholic patronage system. Like, this is how the nonprofit came to be. And so when we're asking folks to come in and work in that kind of container, we have to acknowledge how problematic it is to develop these sincere relationships in a space that is inherently very uncomfortable and has served white folks predominantly. And so something that we're really thinking a lot about right now, and this is a conversation that I very recently had with Jordan, is, and this is new for me, is thinking about how the work of the collective is disguised by the institution. I can see the drastic change that has come up in AK since the collective has taken the leadership. But there isn't, the institutional framework isn't a space that helps, that allows, that enables them to feel confident, to feel like they could fail, even though the work they're doing is familiar to them in their communities. AK is not the place that allows that to be so evident to everybody that's coming together and working together. And that is just like a new thing for me to understand and recognize.
Thanks. There's Sarah in the chat has just said, and so we'll touch on it right now since we're talking about it. What does embedding governance and leadership in their programming look like? What does that mean?
For me, that has meant that, let's say, sorry, for AK, that has meant that working with artists means having very distinct conversations with them about the work that we're doing behind the scenes in the leadership structure, but also understanding that almost all of the work that shows up at AK is related to the governance, whether it's dealing with anti-racism, whether it's dealing with even though it feels unrelated, the structure of institutions, that's been part of so many conversations with artists that even though, let's say you walk into the gallery to an exhibition, you might not see it right at the core forefront of the work. But as an example, we just did a project curated by Missy LeBlanc that was all about Indigenous sovereignty through language. And her core goal was to make language show up and be visible. And so that is directly tied to the work that the collective is doing.
That's great. Thanks, Tarin. I'm going to do my plug right now for some theater because it seems to dovetail. We are opening some theaters, Theater in the Park, which is our annual show tonight. And in the decade that I've been working with some, we've moved very closely to values, and values driving everything. So the values are embedded in the company, and then all of the choices that are made are tested against the values. And we used to have 11 of them. And last year or the year before, we did some internal work and we came up with 5 values, which are, it spells fire, but with 2 I's: fun, innovation, inclusion, reciprocity, and empathy. And we work with those, and everything is tested against those values. And that moves upwards to our board of directors and laterally with our artists. And so all of the choices that we make in our programming are tested against our values. This year, the show and Saskatchewan Arts Alliance, as it happens, it's their show tonight. They've sponsored the show, our opening show tonight at Grosvenor Park in Saskatoon. That's why I'm wearing my Some Bunny Hug. The show is about climate breakdown. It's a family show. It's, you know, this is a challenge of like, how do you make art that speaks to the world in which we exist? But it is the biggest question. You know, we had to cancel a show yesterday because of the smoke, which everything is connected to everything else. So, and yet with some theater, there are moments when we are still grappling with that relationship with the board of directors that has to be there because of legalities and the values of the company and the way we make decisions. We work in this shape. There's right now 1, 2, 4 of us, and we all carry different weights in the company in terms of our portfolios, but we make all the decisions team-wise, and everything takes longer to do in this way, right? Everything takes longer. And I don't know that that's a bad thing, like slow art, right? I'm going to, just before I go to this, I'm actually going to read Carla's notes that are in the chat, and then I'm going to ask Jordan to speak about context and an example. Carla says, I love the question about governance structure, and I appreciate that Sarah asked this because I think language is so often a barrier for folks who are not colonial graduates. I would love for this sort of conversation to always be returning to simple language for these discussions and not assuming that people are familiar with academic language or letters, right? SAA is the Saskatchewan Arts Alliance. And all of us, those of us who are in, know what all the letters stand for. And if you don't know those letters, you can feel like you are out. So thank you, Carla, for the note. Jordan.
Wow, there is so much juiciness and knowledge packed into all the sharing. In fact, I think holding space for this conversation has caused me to kind of throw out my notes. I came prepared to share something really different. And I think what I want to share with you instead is a really different kind of story, which takes place within my nervous system. So I reflect back that, you know, when Yvette and I first met over Zoom, just even to prepare for this conversation, Yvette, you know, in a really firm and loving and caring way, really asked me to not focus on the problem like we talked about at the beginning and like think about hope. And then, and even now, like coming into this space this morning, I felt a lot of anxiety around that. And it's taken me from that conversation till now, I think, to excavate sort of what that signal was trying to tell me. And I think one of the things is that when I hear someone telling me to focus or encouraging me to focus on solutions, that brings up a trauma response that I have from working in nonprofits. Because so often, right, the pace of this work requires, like I think Tarin and Erin are both sharing, a kind of relationship to output and to productivity, which often also is absent of the care and the relationality, I think crucially, that is really what makes these nonprofits not dead colonial structures meant to launder stolen land, stolen bodies, stolen wealth, but actually what they were supposed to be, which is spaces for community, right? So, you know, one of the last words that you said, Yvette, just even now, was slow art, right? I think that is a really important thing. So even though, you know, I spend most of my time all throughout the week, random times, not any like regular working hours, just connecting with really lots of different communities around these values, I still feel that anxiety in my body. So to me, I think what I'm trying to model here is at what deep level, what somatic level. So when I say somatic, again, like checking in on my sort of academic or institutional bias, like Carla and Sarah are sharing. You know, I'm thinking about my intellect integrated with my body, right? So instead of this really Eurocentric, again, notion of the self being a disembodied intellect governing all of my actions, my body is telling me something different. And as a racialized and multi-hyphenated person navigating through these systems, I hold both privileged identities and social locations, and also ones that are oppressed or marginalized or invisibilized simultaneously sometimes, right? So that can be a bewildering calculus. And I feel like sometimes the only way I can find my way through that is to develop a very internal sense of how my body's feeling in these spaces and leverage those insights when I'm working with communities and facilitating spaces to be guided by what my heart space is telling me about what our relations are like within that space, which is also, I think, what Yvette is modeling when guiding us in this conversation. So it's very humbling, right? You may come in a space like this thinking, okay, these three people are going to tell us all these technical solutions to how to make our spaces anti-oppressive. But I think what I'm here to say is that is an ongoing process where you're navigating multiple scales of complexity and self, from the self connected through the communal, through the societal, like all the way up to the system, sometimes simultaneously, right? So in order to be able to navigate that, you really have to take care of yourself and be very present with the signals that are coming up. And in order to be able to do that, we need to have spaces where there is enough space for that care. There is enough space and enough gentleness and generosity when it comes to time that people are able to first self-regulate and then co-regulate together and offer their best selves. So again, equity work needs to go from equity to anti-oppressive work, so that not only from the principled reason of like justice, but for the very practical reason of we're not allowing folks to be their best selves in these spaces. So how can our communities possibly benefit? And all of that has to do with, again, the verticality of these structures and the distance that for some reason we all just default to this board culture where somehow we're proxies for community instead of the community, with the community. So I'll leave it there and pass it to my other great panelists.
Yeah, I will put in at this moment that one of my elders says that the elder doesn't hold the knowledge, the elder holds the circle and the circle holds the knowledge, which is why I want these, this conversation. It isn't just like these three people are going to come and fix your problems. It's like, what have we learned and how can we put all of this knowledge into a bundle? So any, like, Erin or Tarin want to respond or to Jordan?
I would love to offer gratitude for the co-guidance. I think I kind of lost myself in my response to the question, Yvette, so thank you to you and to Jordan. In the realm of hope, I wanted to offer something that came up for me yesterday, which was a really welcome reminder from Sarah Wolf, who is an Anishinaabe midwife and so many things. Currently, she's working on the Indigenous Innovation Initiative with Grand Challenges Canada. And I think when we think about, even with anti-oppression or reimagining something, our bodies seize up, right? We change, the unknown, the fear of trying something new and not having it work, especially while we're working in a sector, an industry, a space where there are very colonial things still in place that are oppressing us daily. And so there's a resistance that I think is kind of innate in humans when we're faced with that unknown. And participating in something like a reimagining governance project, people are always asking for solutions and examples. And the reality is that we're all just experimenting right now, right? I think we're in the start of sort of like a swell of like a wave, where, as Yvette said, there's like a moment of change that we're in. And when we're in it, we can't sort of lift up and see, oh, okay, here's something that worked, and this is something that helped success. So the learning I wanted to offer was the reminder that innovation, like doing new things or finding new solutions, can also mean rediscovering or reconnecting with the knowledge that has been available to us all along. And I would love to share a tangible example of that. As we've been discussing, when we think about governance, we tend to think about this really like top down. As I love this visual, of an upward sort of scale to a more horizontal look. And we forget that we all share responsibilities, right? Again, going back to this idea that governance isn't this some heady thing that you have to go to Harvard to learn, it's how we make decisions together. And so one really real problem that smaller organizations or organizations in Northern Ontario or in rural areas are facing is that they just cannot find board members, and they're struggling. And as Marianne pointed out in the chat, there's all these pressures for grassroots organizations or unincorporated groups to incorporate so that you can access funding. And then there's a lot of things that you're told you have to do in order to receive that, or you have to have certain structures and certain titles and certain roles and stuff like that. And so it stops you from trying new stuff. I was having a conversation with some folks up in the Perth-Huron region of Ontario, and they were just, so pressed about, there's, let's say, 7 nonprofits who really need to recruit new board members, and there's only a handful of people who are sort of seem to be holding institutional knowledge that would help guide, the organization and their governance. And so there's this competition, right? Like, no, we want that board member. No, we want that board member. And when we started talking about, okay, if we stop thinking about our boards and trying to recruit for them, what if we ask, like, how can we share this wisdom? How can we share the expertise that these individuals have without necessarily pigeonholing them into, okay, you're going to go and be the board member for this one organization? How can we have a circle or a group of people who hold that wisdom that all the organizations can share and tap into? And perhaps they're not necessarily on the board, but it's another way of thinking about how can we share the wisdom and experience that exists without having to compete by pushing them into these structures. So really, there's no sort of clear answer in terms of what that might look like, but the conversation very much was then, okay, well, how can we do that in a way that everyone feels that they have access? How can we do that in a way where there's care and support? What can we ask of people, and what do we need to look for elsewhere? So I think the hope lies in realizing that we don't necessarily have to come up with a shiny new, brand new way of doing governance with like 8 tenets of whatever, but rather just really thinking about it in a very human way of like, if this is a thing we need to do and we know that we're going in this direction, how can we take care of each other and head there together, So I hope and I think that there's more conversations like that happening around things like governance.
Mm-hmm. Tarin, did you want in?
Yeah, I love, like, isn't it crazy that we have to remind ourselves to think that we're all human beings showing up with a whole bunch of other things going on, but we do. And I love that you brought that to the fore, because I think it really deserves verbalizing, because we forget. And I'm reading what Marianne has written here in the chat as well. And for a long time, I had participated in boards, volunteering on boards, being asked to serve in a particular way. We want you to join because blah, you know, these kinds of things. And I was, a couple of times I was on boards that were in crisis points. I was on the board of the Artist Run Conference of Canada. I've been part of National Arts Service organizations, of lobbying the Canada Council to rethink reducing funding structures, you know, and I've been part of folks who've been doing that work for such a long time, and they believe in that like political struggle and lobbying for change. And I don't know if that works. Maybe it works eventually. I don't know. I'm not an expert in that, but from what I've watched of that, and somehow the short amount of time that we have to do the work that we do, you know, in our time that we're offering ourselves to these organizations, when I pitched to AK that we just, you know, cross the T's and dot the I's of bureaucracy so that we could maintain our funding and free ourselves. And what I mean by that is we just said, hey, the CRA says you need 3 people on an executive that meet a couple times a year and make sure everything's on the financial track. We're going to do that. And so doing that just allowed us to say, we're not going to worry about that anymore. We are now going to figure out what it means to build relationships with each other as part of the communities that we serve. We're going to think about our values. We're going to think about our group agreements that we need to make. We're going to compensate people for the time that they're showing up, and not enough compensation, but a start toward compensation. And you know, something that was really key for AK was removing from the bylaws that no one who is contributing to the leadership of the organization was allowed to be an artist that presented at the organization. And I thought that doesn't even make sense to this group of folks. Like, I have to tell them that by joining AK that they can't engage with AK somehow. It's such a strange dynamic. And so I believe that you can still function within the bureaucracy required for now to be stably funded. And it is a drain. And that, you know, I'm a privileged person that understands how to work in that system. And it is a hard thing to feel free to operate in that system and also try to understand how that system is impacting and impeding the work of the equity deserving folks who are showing up to lead AK. But the change, I believe that the change we made has produced drastic ways of connecting at AK.
Thanks, Tarin. Jordan?
I just want to throw in something really quick, which are solutions based, and I think connects to what Tarin and Erin are talking about. So, you know, as you're designing what your experiments are around anti-oppression work, a couple of really practical things that I think connect to what everyone else is sharing today. One is harm reduction, right? So that is a really, I think, convenient and nice package of a lot of different considerations and also pace of work that will allow you to kind of calibrate what your interventions are in a way that doesn't make this harm inevitable. And then I would say, you know, as we're talking about resourcing, again, in a capitalist society, which is interconnected with colonialism, right? We're always talking about money, but I think sometimes things like time and rest are also as important, if not more crucial. Sometimes the money can cause harm if it's connected to ways that the system wants you to work. So, you know, like for myself or for Erin or for, you know, other folks that are holding a lot of like intersectional identities in the spaces, sometimes our existence within that structure is radical. So for me, a victory is not sometimes all of the measurables that the funder wants us to check, right? It's instead, have I made a tangible and material impact on the lives of the artists that we're working with, as if they're whole human beings and not just their output? And in capitalism and also our sort of neoliberal, outcome-focused arts sector, right? That's a very radical idea. So I just wanted to share that as something really tangible to grasp onto, if that's helpful.
Yeah, I'd like to just address, like, bring some of this stuff together in a second. When Jordan, thank you for talking about the somatic response to the questions and everything, because it speaks to the governance model, right? Like, if we are actually committed to being well in our workplaces, then the people who will continue to serve in those high pressure positions are trained a different way. So like, it's the institution itself is set up to perpetuate itself, right? So if you are someone who loves, who can be on the board because you have the resources and you have the time and you have the appetite, and you maybe that you're not affected the same way by that kind of whatever the emotion is, whether it's anxiety or like whatever the stress is, then you will stay in that organization, and the people for whom it's too much will leave. And so that's how the institution self-perpetuates, right? Which is why, so here's kind of a sidestep. What we are all doing, what I've been hearing from a lot of, like, I've been interviewing theater makers all over the country for my research. Everyone is creating an alternate model, a parallel model, what Tarin kind of just talked about in terms of, checkboxing, like, this is what we have to do for the CRA, but this is what we're actually doing. So people are creating an alternate model, which in some ways, and someone said in our discussion, it may have been you, Erin, for now, like, we can do it for now. And the idea being that at some point, the funders will come to a different place and we will be ready, and we won't have to reinvent things, but we'll be like, we've been doing it this way anyway. So now if we can just shift the funding model, and the funders are some of them are working on it. I know some of them have like changed the rules for collectives, for groups. I'm acknowledging, Marian, your yes, as long as we have to fit the funding model, we're spending a lot of energy in trying to get our square pegs into round holes, or whatever the metaphor is. And that it is draining, and it's draining to have to create a second governance model. But for me, coming from Indigenous theater, where we've been doing that all along anyway, because we were waiting for the moment where we would be visible. And that is happening now. Like a bunch of Indigenous artists have been working away on Indigenous theater all of this time, waiting for the moment when we would be invited to stages and fora. And now that the moment's here, it's not like we have to invent new people. We've all been working away in the background. It's just so labor intensive. Okay.
Oh,
yes, Tarin.
I just want to make a quick note about funding as well. Is for about 3 years, I have been on a long pursuit of finding a funder who will fund governance work. And I've tried different writing strategies. I've worked with grant writers, independent grant writers who have high success rates. I've called funders, I've done all the things. And in so far, my experience is like, no matter how you craft it, funders do not seem to understand that is work, strangely, or at least that's how they talk about it to me, is like, and that kind of reinforces what I learned, is that this leadership work is supposed to be inherent to the organization. It's supposed to just be functioning. It's not supposed to be labor intensive. And actually you're funded for the work that you do with artists, right? You're not, but how do you get to the place where funders understand that the work that you do with artists is the work that you're doing with your leadership. And that those two things are, you know, they are different, and they're constantly in transformation. If you're showing up with new folks every couple of years, they're coming in, new group agreements, you know, as Jordan pointed something out to me not too long ago, like, it can't be so solid that when a new group comes together, there's no flexibility. You know, there's not a route forward forever. There is a path to constant and evolving change with some stability, I think. But I do believe that, interestingly, sector and innovation at the Canada Council is open to governance projects. As was their big Cultivate envelope. I had some very productive conversations with them around that. So I think there's beginning to be openings of that conversation.
I agree. And so being ready. There is a question. Charlie has said in the chat a couple of times, put in a note. One is, some nonprofit organizations are membership driven, and the mandate is to meet the members' needs. Hence, the governance is dictated by members' needs, not by board vision. And I've been on member orgs, and of course, you know, the model is slightly different, and yet you are still asking members to do the work for the organization. It's complicated. And the other thing, Charlie later in this chat has said, examples, we asked whether there's examples of alternative models of governance. If anyone has an example or examples, I'm sure there are many. I see Jordan, I see all three of you nodding.
I guess I'll just jump in and say, here's the other part of the equation. I think in our language, sometimes we're talking a lot about people aren't coming up to where we are, right? We're having trouble with recruitment, folks aren't responding to our calls, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If we shift that and we think about, right, going to where the communities that we want to have are already and being of them, I think it's a different thing. And so I think the examples I would offer you, just close at hand are, you know, there are a lot of, for example, ethnocultural organizations that run in completely autonomous and self-determined ways, having an impact in their community, managing resources according to their cultural values and through their own frameworks of relationality. And often those folks perhaps don't have the capacities that fit the way the funders want to fund, right? So if you want to look for alternative governance models, you look for where communities are existing outside of the locus of the structures that even the folks in this room occupy. So we got to go over to them and meet them where they're at. And perhaps, again, the hack is that we have now these structures that we can repurpose, retrofit, and sort of use in service of anti-oppression, which perhaps can be value added to what those communities are already doing. Right. So I would say, when you're looking for alternative governance models, look for where there are groups of people congregating with care and with a strong values alignment that aren't at your table yet. Right. I'll pass it over to Tarin and Erin.
Erin, I'd love to hear more about your collective, which I think is an example of a alternate governance model, as you've got like sort of your board doing the required stuff and then a collective doing other governance work.
Yeah, so what we have to serve the function of the CRA is a micro board. That's how we refer to it. It's 3 people on an executive. They fill the president, VP, secretary, treasurer roles. They meet quarterly, and I am responsible to them. You know, I do provide financial reports, all those kinds of things. So we're not like skirting our fiduciary responsibilities. And then the folks that are on the micro board are also on the collective. So there is we struggled for a little while to try to figure out how there was a responsibility between the microboard and the collective. And what we kind of slowly learned is right now, most of the collective who is not part of the microboard are unconcerned with the activities of the microboard. And actually, as long as things are functioning properly, it's a distraction. They don't want to be concerned with it. And so the collective as a whole, there's some core group agreements, and those are, they do continually shift, but right now the group agreements are essentially that people are compensated, that that equity deserving folks are joining together with a mentor or friend. They're not showing up alone and kind of unmoored in the group. And that's a credit to Ruth Cuthand, someone who was on our board before we really started this drastic change. She brought on Aurora Wolf, and together they kind of established this buddy system that's really been functioning for us. And it seems also for them. The third one is that the collective must be a minority of white folks. And that's our core agreements at the moment. And we are in a learning process, even as it is 2 years and, half of the collective is at the point that we're leaving. The collective programs, the AKA, which is a huge shift. It used to be, I was the, curatorial lead and I was bringing projects forward. Now the collective brings projects forward. They also review submissions. They also bring things in from the communities they're working in and tie them up with other projects that have been, it's really amazing to watch this conversation happen also in a slow way. Like Yvette is saying, like it does take a lot longer. And as someone who is meeting deadlines from funders, it can be a struggle and create a lot of anxiety for me. And so I continue to see myself as somebody who tries to make that invisible so the collective can do this really important relational work between themselves and the artists and the communities that they are co-authoring some of this work. And so right now we're in a very delicate process of figuring out what a request for a strategic plan means to us. And we are going to make it mean what we want it to mean. And I see, I love Yvette. I met Yvette when I was on the Sask Arts Alliance board, and the work that she does is amazing. And so people are doing this, the limitations of sitting on a board is really just everybody there decided that it was okay to be on a board together and follow the rules that were there. That's the only limitation. You can change it.
Thank you so much, Tarin. It's so exciting actually to hear about the work of the AKA Collective. So I'm going to have to follow up with you after. I appreciate it because it's a tangible example of, with reimagining governance, unfortunately, we have been a lot in the side of like theory and thinking because it's the organizations out there who are really like digging in and experimenting. So something that we've really embraced is the idea of narrowing down the minimum requirements, right? So exactly what you said, that micro board, I've also heard it referred to as a minimally viable board, where it's the minimum requirement of 3 people, and it's carrying out the base legal and regulatory requirements, which is like a very small percentage of what governance responsibilities actually encompass. Like the fiduciary responsibilities do not include contributing to the strategic vision of an organization and thinking about its purpose. That's governance work, but it does not have to live in the board. I'm not trying to say the board should not be involved in that if they want to be, but this idea of what do we have to do because the powers that be say we have to do it, and then what is all the other stuff and who is best positioned to do that work. So for AKA being an artist collective. And I think in the arts, I've seen this approach quite a bit of have a smaller board and then have a collective of people who are doing the work, who are engaging in the work in the communities. And I think this is where the conversation around governance and justice work intersect, because when we think about actively getting away from oppressive or colonial ways of working, we can't just expect a board of 8 or 10 people to like meaningfully represent the community and do all of this stuff and be interested in things like reviewing financial reports, right? And so I also see this a lot in youth-led organizations where there might be a mandate that the board has, let's say, half of the organization must be young people, which in theory sounds like a great way to engage young people, but in reality, sometimes those young people who are on the board are not in a position to contribute in the way that the board structure might demand, right? And so how can those people be engaged in governance decision-making that are not only critical to like the organization's work, but to the impact that that organization is having in the community? Is why not form a collective? Why not form a brain trust, a whatever you want to call it, of people and figure out the terms that work for you? Maybe it's time bound, maybe it's project bound, maybe it's issue bound because, you know, in 1 year your organization's facing a massive change in your purpose. So why not have different ways of gathering people who are affected by or have experience in those issues to then guide governance work that don't have to be tied to the board? My last reflection would just be like, in queer spaces, you have so many examples of alternative family models, right? Alternative parenting models, but we have a sort of understood heteronormative idea of like, children are raised by mom and dad. And if we kind of translate that idea of families or how we choose to live and love together into how we do governance work, there isn't one way to do that. You can figure out what works best, you know, for you, but you've got to have that trust, that communication, those boundaries and accountabilities to make sure that you're actually doing, you know, what you need to be doing. So yeah, really appreciate this idea, Tarin, of a micro board and then sharing governance work with people outside of this traditional board structure. I really appreciate that.
That's great. Thank you all. There's a bunch of stuff happening in the chat, suggestions, offers. I do think I wanted to comment on, and I don't know where this came in the conversation because now I feel like we're Borg brain or something. We're all just one brain. But the idea of governance and bringing it inside because someone said, who was it? April said, artist representation is really important to many artist run organizations, but it's a lot of unpaid labor. And I'm like, but I think we said this right at the beginning of the conversation, isn't governance of ourselves part of the work? And therefore, I'm back to slow art. Like if we bring, to whom are we accountable and how? If we bring that question into the organization, doesn't the governance of the organization become the bones, the structure of the organization? And I'll go back to Native Earth. And when I got there, we entrenched my grandcestor teachings, which 7 grandcestor values in the organization in order to have an articulated set of values. I think Native Earth is still using those values. They happen to be from my community, my teachings. But they're similar across many nations. And we spent time in staff meetings where we would sit in circle and everybody on the staff would talk about how they were working with the values. So if they were the marketing department, they'd be like, I'm working with courage right now because I'm finding it really challenging to reach out to people to sell the show. And the outreach department say, I'm working with humility right now because, I talk to people and they're, and so by using the values, by working the values inside the organization, it became a way of governing ourselves that then extended outwards to our next circle, which is the artists we work with, the board of directors, and we were able to keep going without needing, like, we didn't go to a micro board as Tarin has described it, but that's kind of what we were doing. We're taking care of the accountability inside the organization and making decisions based on our relationships with our communities, and someone else is checking those boxes over there. It was flawed. It was all 20 years ago now. So it was just a beginning for us, but it feels to me like as long as we're saying the governance is outside of the organization and the work, we're going to keep running into these problems. End of thought, as one of my colleagues likes to say. Okay, I'm looking at a bazillion things in the chat. I'm going to say some of them out loud, but also it's like 22 minutes past the hour. And, I would like to welcome everyone who's like, hi, Misty, you're at the top of my screen. Everyone who's out there in the interwebs, if they want to speak, like their voice or put their hand up or things. And in the meantime, I'm going to say some things that are happening in the chat. Jordan put into the chat, so people grab the chat info as you go along. Another specific example from Treaty 7 of anti-oppressive values aligned governance, and their NakotaAVClub.com. In response to Erin's sharing, one size fits one inclusive design principle. And this is the thing about, I think, for me, us being prepared for when the change happens, that it's like, yes, this is how we are governing ourselves. And we should be, that's what we're doing. And we are accountable to our own governance model. Evie Ruddy, hey, hi, has offered an anti-colonial feminist, an example of an anti-colonial feminist lab in a university operating similarly. And there are some links in there in their lab book, videos on how to collectively establish values. The website is there. And then Evie says, we are doing something similar at the Transgender Media Lab at Carleton University, including drafting a lab book with our values and protocols and publishing a yearly accountability report. Charlie says, microboard and advisory council, is that a new version of executive and committees? And Jordan has responded, maybe more like a temporary adaptation until our philanthropic models overhauled and decolonized. Acceptation, that's good. Repurposing. Jane White, I've been a part of groups where a champion with a passion, an idea, and the energy to implement take a leadership role. The champion sets the agenda, the board provides the legal financial structure, but the project's led by the people who share the enthusiasm. When the project is done or the champion moves on, there's room for new champions to come on, continue, renew, or completely change direction. Tarin, I found Yosomi Imolu's 14 points on the limit of knowledge and care to be very thought-provoking when I started this work. Again, I'm encouraging friends in the room to be grabbing info from the chat and copying it, because when we disappear, well, actually this is recorded, so it will be somewhere, but I don't know if the chat is captured. Darren says, I'm having trouble understanding the notion that I see you, Jordan, that funders asking for certain rules are unreasonable funders. I understand that not-for-profits rely on funding, but we never have to accept funding that imposes too many rules on us. Can someone reconcile? Jordan, I see you.
I'm going to jump in because I think this is part of my own journey, and I think part of what it looks like for me to work on repair and restoration, having been complicit within that philanthropic model for a long time. So I really love this question, Darren. I think I'll go back to something that someone else said, which was that none of us who are arts workers ever grew up thinking we were going to be nonprofit workers. The same thing is true as a funder. I thought that I was coming into the arts community to be an artist and to get closer to community and serve my practice. Inevitably, I found out that the way that I had to survive was to navigate this nonprofit structure, and then that's how I became someone working within these granting systems. And I think the reason why I share that with you is because this philanthropic structure is not natural. It's not organic. It's not from the community, okay? In fact, I can tell you straight up, like a lot of my labor as a grants officer wasn't in supporting artists like it should be. In fact, I try to make as much space as possible for that. For the most part, the labor of a grantor is to create and run a filtration system. So again, we're all existing in conditions of capitalism and scarcity. There's this notion that there isn't enough resources to go around, right? So all of us nonprofits who are trying to do community good are seeing ourselves as separate from each other and not really thinking about collective action, right? So the funders are sometimes just creating matrices and criteria that just allow them to sort organizations. And sometimes, oftentimes, most times, all the time, those structures and criteria are actually just make work for your organizations. I think you all know this intrinsically. The questions that your funders are asking you are not value added, right? It's another hoop that you have to jump through. So if you are from a community that experiences the systemic barriers and your funders are asking you for these things that aren't connected at all to how you're doing your work, that means that you're not going to navigate through that system, and then society doesn't have the benefit of what your organization has to offer in a way that can be scaled to other communities. So in other words, the funders are right now responding to the problem, right? And instead of challenging and critiquing it and using that altitude and that power and that leverage to help create conditions where we can all, in a really relational, in a good way, work together to unpack these systems. So it isn't good enough for funders to just ask us any questions and we can decide to use it or not, because for multi-marginalized communities, these funding structures can be the difference between their community's survival and well-being and human dignity or not. So I'll pass it over to Tarin and Erin if they have anything that they want to add to that. But that's from a funder. I worked 10 years on this and I just keep seeing the same people coming to me asking for help. And I just know that they're not going to make it through these funding systems. I actually had to learn how to intervene. And again, just as a funder, find ways to hack that system and just get the support that they needed without re-traumatizing them and extracting and also tokenizing them with thinking that going through these granting processes are actually value add for their community.
Tarin, Erin?
I don't think that I have any knowledge to share after what Jordan said. That's it. You know, the granting system doesn't serve you.
Okay, Erin, I see you, Carla.
I'd love to leave space for Carla's question.
Yep, Carla.
I hope it's not like awful. I was actually going to respond there to Jordan because I really appreciate that. Like, I feel that I've seen it often with disability. We're like the only province that does not acknowledge disabled artists as a collective, really, with certain groups of our funding, which has made some of our organizations rely on approaching funding through an education side when that's not our intent at all. And so then we've had to do things like getting accessibility grants, which, you know, that's the only way we're in the door as a collective of disabled artists, instead of people providing support as a like entertainment instead of us as professional artists. And so having that kind of difficulty, because it would be ideal in my perspective for every other arts organization to acquire accessibility funding and use that for their own training. However, each time another organization does that, it reduces what we can apply for. And so, you know, you have these groups of people that are doing incredible work that just don't fit into the capitalist model of, oh, are you a theater company? Well, then you should have 8 productions in the year and you should, you know, do these sorts of expected things, and you're based on output as opposed to development, which has been lacking for such long periods of time. So yeah, I would just really agree with Jordan. I feel that a lot of things that until you're working with a different group, you might not realize that that investment is what we're really lacking. And that opportunity to identify specifically and like work together in that way.
Thanks, Carla. April in the chat asked Tarin if AKA has had problems with funders after transitioning to a collective. Tarin, did you want to say those words out loud? I know you answered in the chat.
Sure. I have been typically very timid about stepping outside of the container that funders provide as like eligibility, what we're looking for, merit, all of these things. I'm a studier, a researcher. I use the keywords. I just work really hard to get the money. That's what I've done. And I think I've begun to shift and try to use some of that to pair it with the new work we're doing and to really try to reframe in my mind, because I see there was another comment about that in the chat, like, isn't this so taxing? It's extra work, it's on top of that. And the collective has helped me to see and understand that this work is as vital in the scope of your year. You're looking at your budget, you're looking at your program. It's vital to that work. So maybe you need to I know this is like, for us, we had to reprioritize. So now when I look at my budget and I look at my programs that I fund, one of them is the governance work that the collective does. And that's unchanging. That's their compensation. That's them getting together. That's paying community folks to come in and be part of the process. That's even, that's working to provide funds for the collective to meet one-on-one with other folks they want to bring in and be part of the conversation. And I have had to stretch to think like that, but it is helping me to talk to the funders about it in an artistic, visual, fund this program way. And so far, I have not been met with any resistance. And I really thought that there was going to be pushback from paying the collective and classifying them in the artist fee category. And there has not from provincial or national funders.
Great, thank you. Ryan, I know you want to speak.
Hello, can you hear me right now?
Yes.
Perfect. My name is Ryan Ross. I'm from Montreal Lake in northern Saskatchewan, from Treaty 6. I'm currently in Saskatoon right now. I wanted to join this and talk to people about a new or an old art form that I'm going to be bringing back to Saskatchewan. I'm a self-taught artist. I practice an art form called precision or meat point faceting. So I'm actually what is called a lapidary gem cutter. I take rough, uncut stones and I turn them into gemstones that have designs and reflections. The difference between what I do and what you would see in a store is they cut for weight and size. I cut for design and reflection. And when everybody was talking about funding and stuff like that, I also wanted to point out too that in Canada, there's about 100 of us right now. In the United States, there's about 15,000. In Asian countries and across the seas, there's 800,000, close to 1 million. From the community that I come from, I usually deal with jewelry artists or fine art form and stuff like that. Now in Canada, my art form is not really considered an art form. precision gem cutting, and that is not considered it. It takes me anywhere between 8 to 20 hours to cut one gemstone in specific designs and stuff like that. For funding in that, I have applied for funding and stuff through art things and stuff, even SaskArt as well a couple years ago. But I was told because it could be sold for money that I was not allowed to apply for it. And it was weird to me because lots of jewelers could apply for stuff and, you know, purchase silver and stuff like that and gold to use for their art. But me having to purchase an uncut gemstone, which costs way less, and then to actually put time and effort into it would, you know, increase its value to sell. But that's not why I started doing it. I fell in love with the art form. And I'm going to be bringing it to Saskatchewan to teach other people. I've purchased a couple machines as well, and I'm actually in talks with a couple nonprofit places like Saskatoon Makerspace. So I'll be going to a couple meetings with them in a week here to bring it to them, because I want to teach other people. I want other people to be involved in it too. But with all the funding stuff, it's really hard. I mean, especially in an art form that is not considered an art form anymore. It's a dying art form. If you were to look into it, actually, the amount of people that are aging out of it versus new people being taught, they estimate in 10 years it's going to be gone. So I've been doing this for about 3 years, and I just wanted to let people know that I'm bringing it to Saskatchewan for anybody who would like to learn it. And it's not going to be expensive. Like I want other people to learn at a really limited or reduced cost so that they have the option to it. I will even be donating one of my machines to one of these nonprofits so that I could go in and teach people. So.
Right. Thanks, Ryan. And you actually raise a very interesting, this was a challenge for a long time in Canada Council, because Indigenous arts were often said to be crafts and therefore not eligible for funding. And of course, in Indigenous worldview, everything is connected. It's much more holistic than siloed. And so there was a long discussion over the years with Canada Council about art and artisans and the making of things being an art form. So I see that Marion has put in the chat that there are some Canada Council info sessions happening around the province next week that might be helpful to you. And I think, I mean, I'm not, you know, this now is not the time to do a little intervention, but it is about framing, right? It is about your narrative when you do, and your discussion. I know there are funders on this call that you can reach out to. I know Marion's put something useful into the chat. It's about the story you're telling and framing. Which is exactly the same thing about governance, right? It's reframing the story we're telling and then telling our funders that and being, this is how it is. Thank you. Thanks for that, Ryan. And Tarin's everybody's dropping things into the chat now as well. I'm looking at the clock. We have about 6 or 7 minutes left. I'm wondering if there's anyone else in the room who wants to say something before I start wrapping us up.
I have a question.
Yes.
Yvette.
Oh,
Okay.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Yvette and I serve on the same board.
Yes.
Yes, I sit on a board, friends.
I'm very pleased with that. So thank you so much for this lovely conversations, and it is so nice to hear that. And I like to, echo Yvette, I like to see the problems with the hope. And, it is always like a problems come with the solutions. I have one question and a little bit worry about that too, actually. It is really nice that we all trying to take the box out, but are we going to creating a new box? And how we are not creating not the new box, that is the all new things is. When you are building your governor's strategy plans, who's your voice and how you are reflect all the voice in our province? That is important too, because I am serving so many boards, and even, we all have a different background. We're always, unfortunately, limit ourselves with the strong structures and we cannot push it away. Is there any chance to we can bring the different people from the outside and as a human being, because I always used my immigrant woman's hat on with me, because who's our community? Our community is about the just artists have the background, has a, you know, language, some certain of language things, because I came to Canada without a BFA degree or education degree and no language, and I have a language and life barrier. And I just built my life. It took me like 20 years to come to this point. And we have so many unknown and unheard people in our province, and they are coming like, you know, and traditional art background. And you know, we need to help them to continue their career here as artists or their cultures as their community and make this place home. How are you bringing their voice in the strategy plans is important, because if we are always in the same circle, in the same people, in the board members, how we are going to reflect those people's voice in our organizations.
Thanks, Yvette. Cool. I think anything, so I'm going to go back to each of you. I see Philip Adams is in the chat. Philip Adams at SaskArts, please don't hesitate to get in touch with your concerns, frustrations, challenges, and roadblocks you've experienced with the provincial funder. We are constantly in the process of changing up how we go about supporting artists and arts orgs to do the work. There is a phone number and an email. Yes, those, you know, ask the questions. It's great to have the funders in the room hearing what the discussion is, hearing what the frustrations are. Obviously, the reason we do this is so we create networks, so that we make connections, so that this is how I found Jordan is Tarin. I'm like, I want you to be on this panel. Tarin's like, I want Jordan to be on this panel. And Em's like, I want Erin to be on this panel. It's like so great, because now we have all, we hold all of this knowledge together. I just want to, because we're at just about time, I'd like to go around and just have each of our panelists, ask each of our panelists if there is anything they would like to say to close out their section. Everybody looks at the sea. I see Jordan nodding. I know Jordan's ready to go.
You know, there's so much. And, you know, sometimes it can feel like it's overwhelming, and there's really like too many options of where your learning can go. But what I would offer is, like, you know, through all the discomfort, it's a necessary and vital discomfort that we're feeling right now, right? Sometimes I think when our comfort is intertwined with these oppressive systems, extricating ourselves from them, even when we have privilege, can feel like oppression, right? Very careful phrasing there, right? We have privilege, but when that privilege gets taken away from us, it feels like oppression. So, you know, try to find places where you feel really grounded in your body, and think about how you can have a spirit of curiosity. You know, that somatic work, when you feel yourself feeling that anxiety, that stress, that's usually the system talking through you, right? That's usually the system saying, there isn't a solution for this. You're not going to be able to decolonize. What are you talking about? That's a pipe dream. But if you get back to where your values are, and I think for me as a Treaty 7 person and being a treaty person, you know, one of the things that helped me heal is, you know, being invited by Blackfoot elders and elders from all the different Treaty 7 nations to really think about what my relationality looks like, right? And I think relationality, I think if we could sum up everything from this session, relationality is absent from the governance that we default to. So think about that. Bring the feeling of, like, when you're going through your governance spaces and you're trying to redesign new structures, the way that you can tell if it's working or not is how the relationality feels. Even through things like discomfort, like many really juicy, vital, sometimes crunchy and cringy conversations that Tarin and I even share in the space of what we're going through with AKA. Those are gifts, right? So when you feel that moment where you want to pull back, or you even want to be really hard on yourself for not having the answers, go back to that place and just think about, okay, we're not alone in this. And the system is trying to isolate us and trying to make us feel like this is going to be impossible. But when I see someone else who is sharing these values with me, Carla, I've never met you, but your values and your heart sing through in the chat. And Erin, this is our first time meeting, but the way Erin talks, it feels like it's being spoken by my own heart. And same thing with Tarin and Yvette and, you know, all the people sharing this. So that is the power of this work, is that I don't have to feel alone and isolated. And when I feel under-resourced or activated, I have the benefit of a community to fall back into and to embrace and to continue to work alongside. So like the previous speaker, I sorry, I don't remember your name because the names go by so quickly, but you talked about how to bring people's individuality and their voice into the board. That's actually vital, right? If your board doesn't have that, it's not a community to itself. So how can it be a community to anybody else, right? So I'll offer that. And yeah, I thank you for everything that everyone in this space does, seen and unseen, in the words of a good friend of mine. So I'll pass it over to Tarin and Erin.
Thanks, Jordan.
Thank you so much. We aren't alone. I think it's, you know, it can feel very isolating doing this work. And just from the conversations I have doing the network work I do with ONN, the Ontario Nonprofit Network, similar issues spanning our, you know, our space here in your space in Saskatchewan. The lack of core funding, right? The barriers and the gatekeeping that can happen, not always, with funding. There are some interesting examples of funders here who are encouraging organizations to experiment. I think a next step there would be providing money to experiment, because we all know that takes time and energy and resources. But my closing reflection would be that bringing it back to what I shared from Sarah about innovation and new things sometimes coming to us in the form of existing knowledge. In pursuit of this work, we don't have to see it as, you know, oh my gosh, we're going to overhaul everything and we're going to change everything and we don't have time, because that's true. We don't have time to do all that tomorrow. What we can do is start to ask simple, different questions, even opening the conversation in your board or in your leadership of, what do we mean by governance? You know, asking that simple question can uncover one person thinking that governance means control or direction, right? And another person might think that governance means trust. And so even just opening these conversations up and getting on not the same page, but getting an understanding of what we're all bringing into the room when we even just think about that starting place. What is governance? What do we mean? That can help us shift how we approach things, even in the next, you know, decision that has to be made, or the next funding application, let's say, is just starting from that place of, as Jordan said, relationality. So thank you.
Thanks, Erin. Tarin.
I love that. Like, what do we mean when we say that when we started asking what we meant when we said community, outreach, all these key words that we're throwing around all the time that don't really mean innovation, all, like, when we started unpacking what that meant to each of us, we started seeing each other in different ways. And something that that this was an offering also from Jordan and my huge book list, that if anybody wants any of I have a big bibliography of resources I've collected from all the folks that have shared with me. But when I read Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Marie Brown, the thing that stays with me, that's on my bedside table. I love, yes, it's needed. Holding change also. The thing that stays with me is when I get anxious, when I get feeling like I have to have a product, I think about working at the speed of trust. And that's in Emergent Strategy, and Adrienne Marie Brown credits that also to Stephen Covey. And so when you think about what that actually means, trust is slow. There so many relationships that I have taken me here 8 years to develop that trust. And some you know, sometimes I mess up, you know, sometimes I fail, I say the wrong thing, and I realize I'm thinking in the wrong way and I need to shift and change. And that's what Jordan said too. Like, we do have, crunchy is a good word for it. We do have crunchy conversations, and they are hard. And I've come to feel that when I'm uncomfortable, I'm learning something about myself that I have assumed probably for my whole life, and I need to unpack it. And it's my responsibility to do that, also on my own time, you know, to take that away and not make other people endure and feel that. And so, yeah, I think you both said it. It is about just relating to each other and being slow and connected.
Thank you, Tarin. Thank you all, our panelists, for joining us and thinking out loud for us, to everyone who came to the room to think with us, to Saskatchewan Arts Alliance for hosting this. I'll throw it back to Em and to take us to the next moment. Thank you all.